Chapter 1. A Village Wedding and a Curious Death. St. Mary Mead was in its usual summer bloom, every hedgerow alive with delicate wildflowers, and each small front garden a proud display of neatly trimmed lawns, climbing roses, and pastel-hued pansies. Cottage windows, flung open to invite the mild air, revealed glimpses of chintz curtains and well-loved armchairs. Ordinarily a quiet, unhurried place, the village had suddenly found itself all a-bustle with anticipation. After all, there was to be a wedding, one of the most notable social events of the year. Young Emily Parker, sweet-faced and well-liked, was to marry Gregory Green, who had only recently taken a cottage in the area, but had already charmed half the villagers. He was, by local standards, something of a cosmopolitan figure, having worked in London for a spell. The engagement had been announced in spring, and now, under the gentle warmth of a late June sun, final preparations were underway. There were sashes to be tied, flowers to be arranged, and seating plans to be debated. While some in St. Mary Mead assumed that weddings arose spontaneously from the benevolence of the heavens, Miss Jane Marple knew better. She had witnessed enough gatherings, festive and otherwise, to understand that perfect occasions require meticulous planning. Not that Miss Marple was directly involved in the planning herself, of course. She was merely on the periphery, keeping an attentive eye on the goings-on. From the cosy vantage point of her sitting-room window, she could watch neighbours hurry by, with ribbons, linens, and whatever else they could manage to balance in their arms. From time to time, she would step outside to offer a cordial greeting, her keen blue eyes taking in details that others might dismiss as trivial. One such morning, Miss Marple paused in her rose-festooned doorway to chat with Colonel Bantry, who was returning from the Parker household. He carried an impressive bunch of freshly cut peonies, their petals a lush pink. His large moustache twitched with satisfaction as he informed Miss Marple that the flowers would grace the church during the wedding service. "Ah, Miss Marple," he said with a courteous tip of his hat. "This village won't see such a to-do for quite some time, I imagine." She smiled. "Well, Colonel, you know how weddings are. An occasion that brings out the best in people, usually. I do hope all goes smoothly for the young couple." Yes, of course," he replied. "Although I must say the last wedding in these parts had its own complications. Do you recall the dreadful business with the caterer's missing cake?" Miss Marple allowed herself a tiny chuckle. "Indeed I do. Let us hope no such mishap befalls Emily and Gregory." The Colonel nodded and continued on his way, leaving Miss Marple to mull over small village gossip. She took a moment to tidy a trailing stem of her climbing roses, then withdrew into the cool comfort of her parlour to resume her morning routine. A pot of tea, a slice of sponge cake, and a bit of embroidery. With her needle poised over a half-finished floral design, she let her thoughts wander. Weddings, after all, could be catalysts for tensions. Families gathered, old friends reappeared, and sometimes old quarrels re-emerged. Around midday, she heard the distant clang of a bicycle bell. Peering out her window, she saw the postman delivering letters along the lane. Nothing unusual in that, except that he paused at Mr. Jeremiah Blythe's cottage, half hidden by a row of lilac bushes across the road. Mr. Blythe was a recent arrival to the village and had kept rather to himself. A tall, spare man, in his late 60s, he appeared to prefer solitary walks and the occasional meal at the local pub. Yet, in the last few weeks, Miss Marple had heard enough scattered remarks about visitors, odd parcels, and hush-hush conversations to wonder if there might be more to his story, something she sensed was causing him worry. After lunch, Miss Marple pushed such musings aside, for Mrs. Dolly Finch dropped by. Dolly was one of those delightful, if somewhat talkative neighbours who had an encyclopedic knowledge of local happenings. Over a cup of tea, Dolly rattled off updates about the wedding reception. The table linens ordered from a catalogue, the suggestion of salmon mousse for starters, and a last-minute squabble over the cake topper. Miss Marple nodded politely, gleaning a few interesting snippets about who might be jealous, who might be harbouring resentments. One never knew when those little morsels of village gossip might prove illuminating. It was nearing tea's end when Dolly lowered her voice conspiratorially. "Of course, you've heard about Mr. Blythe's sudden spell, haven't you?" "A spell?" repeated Miss Marple, eyebrows lifting. Dolly nodded with grim satisfaction at being the bearer of fresh tidings. "Not 2 days ago I saw Dr. Haydock cycling away from Blythe's cottage. Looked all in a hurry, too. Didn't see Mr. Blythe out for his usual walk yesterday, some suspect an ailment. Sad business, really. He's not very old in spirit, still quite spry on his feet. But these things can happen." Polite though she was, Miss Marple didn't entirely trust Dolly's version of events. Dolly often spiced her stories with bits of conjecture. Nevertheless, it was intriguing. If Mr. Blythe was unwell, perhaps that explained the hush and the occasional worried glance from Dr. Haydock whenever Mr. Blythe's name was mentioned. It could be nothing, but it could be more. With Dolly's departure, Miss Marple straightened her teacups and allowed herself one small frown of concern. That evening, the sky was a serene swathe of lavender, the sun sinking just behind the silhouette of the church steeple. Miss Marple took her habitual evening walk, just a short circuit of the village lanes, to clear her head and greet any neighbours enjoying the pleasant twilight air. She exchanged pleasantries with Mrs. Parker, who stood by her garden gate, wringing her hands about tomorrow's schedule. The florist would arrive at dawn, the hairdresser an hour later. Emily was apparently inside, exhausted from final dress fittings and endless questions about place settings. "She's such a dear girl," Mrs. Parker confided. "But I do worry. All the stress seems to have her quite on edge. I'm sure she'll be happier once the day's over and she's properly married." Miss Marple offered a comforting smile. "Weddings can be overwhelming, no doubt, but I'm certain all will go well." Mrs. Parker nodded gratefully. "You're very kind, Miss Marple." "Good night, then." With a gentle good evening, Miss Marple continued her walk. She meandered past the vicarage, noting a light still burning in Reverend Caldecott's study. He too would have important work to do for the ceremony, papers to sign, vows to review. In the hush of the warm evening, her path eventually took her near Mr. Blythe's cottage. She glanced at his windows. No light shone within. Perhaps he had turned in early. It was in the hours before dawn that St. Mary Mead was wrenched from its slumber by dreadful news. Miss Marple woke to the sound of subdued voices outside, and upon peeking through her curtains, she saw Dr. Haydock's car heading toward Mr. Blythe's cottage. Colonel Bantry stood in the lane, his face set in a grim mask. Within minutes, hushed whispers spread. Mr. Blythe had been discovered dead, slumped in his chair, with an expression that spoke not of peaceful passing, but of alarm. At the first reasonable moment, Miss Marple donned her neat cardigan and made her way towards the cottage. She did not go inside, of course. Inspector Slack from Much Benham was already on the premises, keeping onlookers at bay. But she managed to catch Dr. Haydock's eye as he stepped out. He looked troubled, far more so than one would expect for a simple heart failure. Leaning close, he murmured to Miss Marple that it was all very sudden. Indeed, Mr. Blythe had never complained of chest pains or shortness of breath, And there was, Dr. Haydock added, something about the rigidity of Mr. Blythe's posture that didn't quite align with a natural death. Miss Marple's heart fluttered with disquiet. One seldom liked to think of any suspicion of foul play, especially in a peaceful village like St. Mary Mead, but she knew better than most that such things could happen anywhere. She recalled Dolly Finch's earlier mention of Mr. Blythe's spell and Dr. Haydock's worried face. Perhaps there had been more to the matter. This was no time for gossip, though. The formalities would need to be observed, and the cause of Mr. Blythe's death properly determined. Still, Miss Marple resolved to pay attention to every whisper, every anxious glance, and every apparently insignificant detail. In her experience, a series of small clues often formed the truth. That morning, the village awoke to two startling realities: the joyous bustle of wedding preparations and the unthinkable tragedy of Mr. Blythe's passing. Emily Parker's wedding would still go on. Weddings rarely halt for tragedy, however shocking, but a somber undercurrent tainted the celebration. People speculated quietly, torn between offering condolences for the deceased and feeling obliged to preserve the bright optimism of a future bride. Thus, amid the flutter of wedding veils and the heady perfume of fresh peonies, an unsettled hush stole into St. Mary Mead, and Miss Marple, that gentle, unassuming figure in a tidy cardigan, sensed a mystery unfolding. She had long since learned that beneath the calm surface of village life, hidden currents could swirl, carrying with them secrets and betrayals yet untold. Chapter 2: Stray Conversations and Sharp Observations. St. Mary Mead awoke the next morning to a peculiar mixture of sorrow and anticipation. Those residents with close ties to the late Mr. Jeremiah Blythe murmured their condolences in hushed tones, while others busied themselves with the ongoing preparations for Emily Parker's impending wedding to Gregory Green. It was a curious contrast. Amid the faint scent of funeral lilies drifted the bright aroma of celebratory roses. Life in the village, it seemed, was as paradoxical as ever. In her comfortable cottage, Miss Marple rose earlier than usual. Although the sun had only just brushed the horizon, she wanted to be sure of catching the milkwoman, who often doubled as a carrier of local gossip. Settling at her table with a warm cup of tea, she found herself thinking of Mr. Blythe's death again. The memory of Dr. Haydock's concerned expression was enough to quicken her pulse. For Dr. Haydock was hardly prone to melodrama. If he suspected something amiss, he usually had good cause. Before she could dwell any further on the matter, a light knock sounded at her front door. She opened it to find Mary, the milkwoman, setting 2 bottles of fresh milk on the step. Mary's cheeks were pink from the morning chill, but her eyes sparkled with curiosity, just the sort Miss Marple had hoped to see. "Morning, Miss Marple," she said, doffing her cap. "Lovely morning, except for the sad news about Mr. Blythe." Miss Marple offered a sympathetic nod. "Yes, such a shock. We shall miss him, I'm sure." Mary paused, glancing about to ensure they weren't overheard by prying ears. "I heard Dr. Haydock say it was sudden. Do you—" She stopped short, lowering her voice to a whisper. "Do you think there's something behind it?" Miss Marple kept her expression mild. "We oughtn't jump to conclusions, Mary. But yes, Doctor, Haydock did seem concerned. One hopes it was just a tragic natural passing, yet one never knows what secrets might lie beneath the surface." Mary gave a quick nod, clearly gratified to share a hint of clandestine intrigue. With that, she bustled off to complete her rounds, leaving Miss Marple with an unsettled feeling. It was not fear exactly, but rather a conviction that some puzzle pieces were out of place. There was no sense ignoring it. Best to keep watch and gather whatever scraps of information she could. That morning, after a modest breakfast, she took a walk through the village. The gentle hush of early summer hung in the air, punctuated by the faint chirping of birds and the soft crunch of gravel underfoot. She waved a greeting to Mrs. Parker, who stood in her front garden anxiously smoothing the folds of her apron. "Oh, Miss Marple," Mrs. Parker said, "I'm sorry. My mind is in 1,000 places. What with the wedding so close and now this awful business with poor Mr. Blythe, one can't help but feel unsettled." She twisted her apron nervously, then added, "You don't suppose this will cast a shadow over the wedding, do you?" Miss Marple replied with gentle reassurance. "I'm sure the wedding will be lovely, my dear. But do try not to overtax yourself. These things have a habit of working out in the end." As Mrs. Parker thanked her, Miss Marple caught a glimpse of Emily through the front window. The bride-to-be sat hunched at the table, her gaze lost in the swirl of teacup steam. There was a sadness about her, or perhaps only wedding nerves. Miss Marple couldn't quite put her finger on it, but she filed the observation away, as she so often did. Moving on, she decided to pay a quick visit to the church. Reverend Caldecott was an amiable man, ever patient and obliging, and as the officiant for Emily's wedding, he would undoubtedly be juggling many tasks. She found the church door ajar. Inside, the stained-glass windows cast soft pools of coloured light on the stone floor. Arrangements of white lilies and pale pink roses had already been placed near the altar in preparation for the forthcoming nuptials, their sweet scent perfuming the still air. The vicar appeared from behind the pulpit, holding a small prayer book. Upon noticing Miss Marple, he offered a warm welcome. "My dear Miss Marple, what brings you here so early? Though I suspect we both know the reason." His kindly face reflected a subdued concern. She returned his greeting. "Good morning, Reverend. I wondered if you might have heard anything new regarding Mr. Blythe's passing. You see, Doctor, Haydock mentioned it was quite unexpected. Perhaps Mr. Blythe confided in you recently." Reverend Caldecott's brow creased. "Well, nothing directly. However, he did come by last week hoping to speak with me privately. Unfortunately, I was called away just then, so we never had that talk. He seemed agitated, I suppose. I'd planned to make time for him, but events intervened." Miss Marple allowed a small sigh. What a pity. One can't help wondering if he had a burden on his mind. "Yes," the vicar agreed, his tone regretful. "If only I had spoken to him, though one cannot dwell on if-onlys. God willing, the truth will out somehow." Miss Marple thanked him for his time and discreetly slipped away, pausing at the church door to look again at the decorations. The wedding was meant to be a joyous occasion, but she sensed a faint tension clinging to the air, something intangible, yet all too real. Stepping back into the sunshine, she nearly bumped into Colonel Bantry, who was in conversation with Inspector Slack near the lich gate. The inspector acknowledged Miss Marple with a brisk nod. She recognized at once that professional glint in his eye, the same glint she had seen during other investigations. The colonel offered a polite tip of the hat, then turned to speak to her. "Miss Marple, good day," he said. "The inspector here is just looking into a few matters. We were discussing Mr. Blythe, naturally." Inspector Slack cleared his throat. "I know you have a knack for noticing details, Miss Marple. If you've observed anything that might be helpful—" Miss Marple kept her voice light, for such was the inspector's way, straight to the point. "I can't claim to have hard evidence, Inspector, but you know I'll keep my ears open. There was something about Mr. Blythe's sudden death that troubled Dr. Haydock. That, in itself, is noteworthy." Slack nodded, jotting something in a small notebook. "Yes, Doctor. Haydock indicated the death might not have been entirely natural. There's talk of some sign of distress on Blythe's face, and more concretely a few unusual bruises on his wrist. Could be nothing. Perhaps he fell. But we'll see. At that, Colonel Bantry interjected. I did hear he had a scuffle of sorts, or at least some heated words, with a visitor not too long ago. Saw a strange figure leaving his cottage late one evening. Never did get a clear look, though. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a snap. Thank you, Colonel, I'll keep that in mind. Then, turning to Miss Marple once more, he added, I'll be about the village, if you remember anything else. Miss Marple watched as Inspector Slack strode off, leaving the Colonel to linger by the churchyard. They exchanged a few remarks about the weather and parted ways. All the while, Miss Marple's thoughts circled around the notion of a late-night visitor at Mr. Blythe's cottage. Who could it have been? On her way back home, she passed by the local grocer's. Standing outside was Mrs. Dolly Finch, that indefatigable source of rumours. Dolly beckoned Miss Marple over with a conspiratorial wink. I'm sure you've heard about the fuss, she began, lowering her voice. Apparently, Mr. Blythe received a letter from London just a day or two before he passed. No one knows who sent it, but I overheard him muttering about old debts coming due. Debts, you say? Miss Marple repeated softly, tucking the information away. Dolly nodded enthusiastically. Yes, indeed, sounds like trouble. They say he was pacing up and down in his garden, letter in hand, as though it carried the plague. Miss Marple thanked her for sharing the news. Knowing Dolly Finch, some of it might be embellished, yet there could well be a kernel of truth. After bidding Dolly good day, she resumed her journey home, her mind abuzz. A visitor leaving Blythe's cottage late one night, a mysterious letter from London, bruises on Blythe's wrist, and a vicar's missed conversation. The pieces felt disconnected. Still, she had an abiding faith that if she kept her eyes open, a pattern would soon emerge. Reaching her cottage, Miss Marple settled into her parlour chair. In her lap rested her knitting bag, though her hands remained still. She gazed out the window at the sunlit lane, mind drifting over all she had learned. Something about Mr. Blythe's life, perhaps something secret, perhaps something mundane, had spilled over into St. Mary Mead, colliding with the wedding preparations and casting an uneasy shadow on the village. Later, as she lit a small lamp against the dimming sky, Miss Marple reminded herself to take one step at a time. She had gleaned enough from past experiences to know that little details, seemingly unrelated, often formed a larger tapestry when examined under the right light. If mischief truly lurked behind Mr. Blythe's death, it would have left its traces in the everyday talk and doings of the village. All she needed was patience, quiet observation, and an ear tuned to the subtleties of human nature. In due course, she felt sure, the truth would begin to reveal itself. Chapter 3. Suspects and Secrets. The day after her conversation with Inspector Slack, Miss Marple awoke with a distinct sense that the threads of Mr. Blythe's untimely demise were slowly starting to tangle. The village itself seemed caught between two states. Half of St. Mary Mead bustled about as though nothing mattered but Emily Parker's upcoming wedding, while the other half watched every stray whisper and every suspicious glance, anticipating revelations in the mystery that hovered like an ominous cloud. By mid-morning, Miss Marple decided to make a brief stop at the local tea shop. It was the sort of place where ordinary villagers paused for a chat and an inexpensive cream bun, and where a person with attentive ears could learn quite a lot. Settling at a small corner table with a cup of Earl Grey, she allowed her gaze to drift across the room. Seated by the window was Mrs. Dolly Finch, the village's self-appointed source of inside information. Across from her sat Colonel Bantry, who appeared to be paying polite attention while Dolly chattered away, her head bobbing in eager animation. Miss Marple smiled to herself. If Dolly had gleaned any fresh tidbits about Mr. Blythe, Colonel Bantry would soon know about them, whether he wished to or not. Presently, Dolly caught sight of Miss Marple and waved her over. "My dear Miss Marple, come join us," she called, patting a vacant chair. The Colonel, for his part, didn't look entirely displeased by the interruption. Once Miss Marple had settled, Dolly wasted no time launching into the latest morsels of intrigue. "I heard from Sally Carter. She's been cleaning for Mr. Blythe these past few weeks, that she found an odd scrap of paper in his waste bin. Something about a due payment and a name she didn't recognize. Now, I only mention this because it fits with what I told you before." He'd been muttering about debts. Colonel Bantry nodded gravely. "Yes, Dolly mentioned this to me as well. Of course, it's all circumstantial. But one cannot help wondering if Mr. Blythe was in financial trouble or on the run from someone. There's also talk he might have come into a small inheritance recently, or so he claimed when he took the cottage." Miss Marple sipped her tea, absorbing every detail. "People often come to a village like St. Mary Mead, seeking tranquility or anonymity," she remarked quietly. "Perhaps Mr. Blythe found both, and yet it seems some element of his past trailed after him." Dolly leaned in, lowering her voice. "Exactly, Miss Marple. And now the poor man's gone, dead before he could settle whatever it was that troubled him." Colonel Bantry cleared his throat, his tone growing more serious. "I must say, though, not all suspicious circumstances lead to murder. Some folk do just, pass on, especially if they've been under stress, but Dr. Haydock's doubts remain." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "It's wise to keep an open mind." They soon parted ways, with Dolly rushing off to share her news at another table. Colonel Bantry, excusing himself, went outside to speak with the stationer about some last-minute wedding invitations on behalf of Mrs. Parker. Miss Marple, left momentarily alone, mulled over Dolly's revelations. Financial troubles, an unrecognized name, a possible inheritance. The tangle seemed to tighten. After leaving the tea shop, Miss Marple headed towards the Parker household. She had in mind a small social call, intending to check on Emily Parker's state of mind. Approaching the house, she found the front door ajar and heard low voices emanating from the parlour. Miss Marple hesitated, not wanting to intrude unannounced. But just then Mrs. Parker bustled into the hallway, her face drawn and worried. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said with a tired sigh, "I'm so glad you've come. Emily has been fretful all morning. Gregory is here trying to calm her, but well, you'll see." Invited into the parlour, Miss Marple discovered Emily seated on a small sofa, eyes rimmed with red. Gregory Green knelt beside her, murmuring reassuring words. He looked up as Miss Marple entered and offered a weak smile, gesturing for her to approach. "I'm so sorry, Miss Marple," Emily began softly, twisting a handkerchief in her hands. "I know I should be thrilled about the wedding, but with Mr. Blythe's death, so sudden and right before our day, it's unnerved me." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on the young bride's arm. "It's perfectly natural to feel unsettled, my dear, especially if there's the slightest suspicion that Mr. Blythe did not die peacefully." Gregory glanced uncertainly at Emily, then confided, "Emily saw Mr. Blythe only a few days ago. He seemed on edge, pacing outside the cottage. She mentioned something about him looking frightened. Ever since the news of his death, she's worried there's more to it." Miss Marple's brow furrowed thoughtfully. "Indeed, sometimes when people carry secrets, it can weigh heavily on their manner. Mrs. Parker, standing by the doorway, chimed in, "Oh, my poor Emily. I wish she didn't have to fret over this now. She needs rest and happiness before her wedding." Miss Marple gave the mother a reassuring pat on the arm. Then, addressing Emily again, she asked gently, "You haven't had any direct involvement in Mr. Blythe's affairs, have you? Sometimes, if we see or hear something, it can weigh on our minds." Emily hesitated. For a moment, Miss Marple saw in her eyes the flicker of someone who holds back a half-remembered confidence, but almost as swiftly, that flicker disappeared. "No," Emily said quietly, "nothing beyond noticing he was distressed. I'm probably just rattled because it happened so close to my wedding." Miss Marple accepted the answer without pressing further. It was possible Emily truly knew nothing concrete. Still, an older and more experienced part of Miss Marple suspected otherwise. She thanked them for their time and excused herself, advising Emily to rest. Gregory guided his fiancée to the sofa again, while Mrs. Parker followed Miss Marple to the door, whispering, "If you learn anything, do let us know. It would mean so much." Leaving the Parkers, Miss Marple decided to visit Dr. Haydock. He might have learned something new from whatever tests or inquiries he was conducting on Mr. Blythe's remains. She found him in his surgery, scribbling notes in a ledger. On seeing her, he removed his spectacles and sighed. "Ah, Miss Marple, I expected you might appear sooner or later." She offered a small smile. "You know how it is, Doctor. One hears things about Mr. Blythe. Well, I thought I'd see if you could clarify." Dr. Haydock nodded, folding his arms. "So far, there's no definitive proof of foul play, but his bruised wrist is still peculiar, and I found slight abrasions on his knuckles, suggesting he might have been in a struggle, or at least he fought back against something. It's not conclusive, but I can't ignore it." Miss Marple's pulse quickened with curiosity. Might he have simply tripped or tried to catch himself against furniture? "It's possible," the doctor conceded, "but, Miss Byers, the pattern suggests a defensive motion." And that final expression on his face, he looked frightened, Miss Marple, truly alarmed. One sees that sometimes with victims of heart failure brought on by extreme shock. "We must wait for further analysis, but I'd say there's reason to suspect he met with violence or terror." Though Miss Marple's gentle features showed concern, she inwardly felt a shift in certainty. This was more than mere village chatter. Mr. Blythe's final hours likely involved confrontation. Thanking Dr. Haydock for his candor, she left the surgery with a sense of both solemnity and purpose. If Mr. Blythe had indeed been threatened or harmed, the question remained, who in St. Mary Mead, or perhaps from beyond, possessed motive enough to risk murder? As she strolled back along the lane, Miss Marple tried to organize her thoughts. She recalled Dolly Finch's mention of a mysterious letter, Colonel Bantry's sighting of a late-night visitor at Blythe's cottage, Emily's observation of him looking terrified, and Dr. Haydock's medical suspicions. These strands formed a tangled knot, and yet from experience, Miss Marple knew that each snippet, each quiet remark, was part of a greater tapestry. Sooner or later, a pattern would emerge. Just as she arrived at her front gate, a soft voice called her name. Turning, Miss Marple saw Louisa Chapman, a quiet widow who rented a room just off the high street. Louisa, limping slightly from a minor ailment, approached with careful steps. She looked uneasy, glancing over her shoulder, as if worried someone might overhear. "Miss Marple," she said in a low tone, I'm not sure if I should say anything, but I know you look into these matters. I saw Mr. Blythe speaking with someone in the lane near my house the night before he died. It was dark, and I couldn't see the other person's face, but they were definitely arguing. I heard raised voices. Mr. Blythe sounded afraid, while the other was quite angry. Miss Marple's expression remained composed, but inside she felt a spike of interest. "Thank you, Louisa. That's most helpful. Did you happen to hear any names mentioned?" Louisa shook her head. "No, just a few words about owing something and not keeping quiet anymore." After that, they moved away. Well, I'm sorry I can't tell you more." Patting Louisa's hand, Miss Marple offered a warm smile. "Don't apologize, dear. What you've shared is significant. If you recall anything else, please do let me know. And be careful. It's often wise to stay vigilant, especially in unsettled times." With a fearful nod, Louisa continued on her way, leaving Miss Marple to reflect upon this latest piece of the puzzle. Evidently, Mr. Blythe had enemies, perhaps from old business dealings, perhaps from personal entanglements. Someone in the village or someone visiting from outside had confronted him, and now he was dead. Quietly letting herself into her cottage, Miss Marple resolved to keep gathering details with her usual patient thoroughness. Sometimes, in a village as small and interwoven as St. Mary Mead, secrets had a way of coming to light in the most mundane of conversations. All that was needed was a watchful ear, a compassionate heart, and a willingness to see beyond the ordinary. And Miss Marple possessed each of those qualities in abundance. Chapter 4. An unsettling discovery. The morning sun found St. Mary Mead bathed in a soft golden light, illuminating bright summer blooms and neat rows of hedges that lined the cottage gardens. From her sitting-room window, Miss Marple watched the dappled sunshine play upon the lane, noticing how even the warmth of the day could not dispel the undercurrent of anxiety lingering in the village. It was now only 3 days before Emily Parker's wedding, yet the excitement that should have filled the air was muted by the quiet, persistent questions regarding Mr. Blythe's passing. Miss Marple could not recall another time when a wedding in St. Mary Mead felt so overshadowed. Passing along the high street, she observed subdued conversations taking place near shop displays. The usual chatter about cake icing or invitation fonts had been replaced by hushed speculations. Who was that mysterious late-night visitor? What was the nature of Mr. Blythe's debts? Did he truly die of fright? Or was there something more sinister afoot? One sensed these unspoken worries lurking behind every polite greeting. Encouraged by Inspector Slack's trust in her observational skills, Miss Marple had resolved to gather as many facts as possible before any wild rumours could take hold. On this particular morning, she set out to speak with Colonel Bantry, who had earlier mentioned overhearing raised voices at Blythe's cottage. Though the Colonel was not always the most meticulous listener, he had an honest streak and a soldier's recollection for detail. She found him in his garden, prodding at a stubborn rhododendron bush that refused to bloom. "Ah, Miss Marple." Colonel Bantry greeted her with a weary salute of his pruning shears. "I take it you're following up on that business at Blythe's house?" Miss Marple nodded gently. "Yes, Colonel. You mentioned seeing a figure leave late at night. I wondered if you remembered anything else, perhaps the person's height or build." The Colonel pursed his lips and leaned against a stone birdbath. "Can't say I saw much, I'm afraid. They move quickly, but something sticks in my mind. The figure wore what looked like a dark cloak or coat, and I recall a glimmer of something reflective, maybe buttons or a buckle." "That's very helpful," she reassured him. "Anything else?" He tapped the side of his temple thoughtfully. "I heard a car engine a few minutes later. It was faint, and I couldn't be certain it belonged to that visitor, but ours is a small village and midnight traffic is rare. Perhaps the person drove off rather than walking home." Buoyed by this clue, Miss Marple thanked him and headed back towards the main lane. As she walked, she spotted Emily Parker exiting the post office. The young woman looked pale and tense, clutching a small package under her arm. Though Miss Marple hesitated to intrude, she found herself calling out, "My dear Emily, are you quite all right?" Emily turned, her eyes darting as if wary of being observed. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, attempting a smile that did not reach her eyes. "I'm fine, really. Just last-minute wedding details, you know. So many things to organize." Miss Marple gently inquired if there was anything specific troubling her. After a moment's hesitation, Emily sighed. "Well, I keep thinking about Mr. Blythe. I can't shake the feeling he was trying to warn someone, or perhaps to confide in them, before he died." She paused, then added, "Sometimes, I even worry Gregory or I might have unwittingly crossed paths with whatever caused him fear." The older woman gave Emily's arm a comforting squeeze. "It's only natural to feel unsettled, my dear, but do try not to let it overshadow your happy day. If there's truly something amiss, we'll see it put right soon enough." Emily nodded, though her expression remained troubled. She said her polite farewells and slipped away, leaving Miss Marple with a pang of sympathy. A wedding ought to be filled with joy, yet Emily's eyes reflected a burden no bride should bear. Deciding not to impose further, Miss Marple continued to the vicarage, hoping that Reverend Caldecott might have gleaned some insight from his parishioners. The vicar welcomed her into his tidy study, which smelled faintly of beeswax and leather-bound hymnals. He confessed that the congregation's mood had shifted in the wake of Mr. Blythe's death. Though many outwardly planned for the wedding, they approached him privately with anxious questions. "They're torn between celebrating and mourning," he explained, offering Miss Marple a seat. "And I must admit, I'm just as perplexed as they are. This was not a man who showed any outward sign of a terminal illness." Miss Marple gave a thoughtful nod. "Indeed, you mentioned he'd wanted to speak with you about something urgent. I do wonder if it concerned debts or blackmail, or even a past wrongdoing." "At time was Rue. Reverend Caldecott's face grew serious. "I believe so. The poor fellow seemed weighed down by the idea that time was running out to set matters straight, as he put it. I'm sorry I didn't press him more then and there." Their conversation was interrupted by a soft rap on the door. Louisa Chapman stood in the entry holding a small envelope. Seeing Miss Marple, she hesitated, then stepped forward. I found this near my back garden wall," Louisa said, her tone quavering. "It's addressed to Mr. Blythe, though. I have no idea how it ended up on my property." Miss Marple accepted the envelope. The paper looked slightly crumpled, as if it had been hurriedly stuffed into a pocket and later discarded. The address, penned in spidery black ink, read simply Mr. Jeremiah Blythe, with no street or postal code. The flap had already been torn open, but the note remained inside. Reverently, she and the vicar looked it over. The message was short, only a few lines. "We haven't forgotten. You owe us, and we'll collect, no matter where you try to hide. You promised to help, but your silence is betrayal. Don't force our hand." The final words ended in a flourish of black strokes, but there was no signature. Miss Marple's heart fluttered with unease. This note lent real credence to the idea that Mr. Blythe had been threatened. Reverend Caldecott exhaled slowly, looking at Louisa in sympathy. "Where exactly did you find it?" "By the garden wall, "Near some ivy," she answered. "I was pruning roses when I saw something white. I'm frightened, Miss Marple. Reverend, I'm frightened about who might have tossed it there." Gently, Miss Marple placed a hand on Louisa's arm. "Let us keep this note safe. I'm sure Inspector Slack will want to see it, but try not to worry too much. We'll get to the bottom of this. Thank you for coming forward." After Louisa departed, the vicar accompanied Miss Marple to the door, each lost in sombre thought. Outside, the sun had risen high, casting sharp shadows on the vicarage lawn. It was a stark reminder that amid the village's everyday brightness, hidden corners lay dark and troubled. With the damning note in hand, Miss Marple proceeded directly to Much Benham's small police station, where Inspector Slack maintained a tidy, if somewhat cramped, office. He scrutinized the letter, eyebrows arching when he read the threatening lines. "Well, Miss Marple," he said, "this certainly points towards blackmail, or something very close to it. If Blythe was involved in shady dealings, perhaps he tried to flee or cut ties, and someone followed him." Miss Marple pressed her lips together thoughtfully. "One wonders whether the writer of this note came to St. Mary Mead in person. Colonel Bantry heard a late-night commotion. Louisa Chapman heard arguments, and Mr. Blythe had bruises, signs of a struggle. This letter could tie all of that together." Inspector Slack set the letter aside, tapping his desk with a pencil. "I'll have our team check the paper and handwriting. Don't expect miracles. These typed or scrawled messages rarely yield tidy evidence, but we must try. Meanwhile, I suggest we stay watchful. If the culprit remains in the area, they might be feeling cornered. That can make people desperate." Thanking him, Miss Marple left the station and walked briskly back to her cottage. Along the way, she passed the Parker home once more. Wedding decorations and floral deliveries continued to arrive in a flurry. She glimpsed Emily's pale face at an upstairs window, a half-smile flickering, then vanishing as the bride drew back from the glass. Miss Marple found her own spirits weighed down by the knowledge that something dangerous lurked under the surface of this seemingly idyllic village. She wished fervently that Emily's big day could proceed without more distress. Shortly before supper, Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet half-hour to reflect. She sat in her parlour, a cool breeze wafting through the lace curtains, the letter's ominous words echoing in her mind. "Don't force our hand. Who were we?" A consortium of aggrieved parties from Mr. Blythe's past. A single individual using intimidation. And how had Blythe truly intended to respond? She considered the possibility that the argument overheard near Louisa's house might not have been a random confrontation. If the letter's sender was in the village that night, they would have confronted Blythe to demand immediate payment or compliance, leading to violence. But there was still no direct link to anyone in St. Mary Mead. None of the villagers, to Miss Marple's knowledge, had a known grudge that severe. Yet sometimes, she reflected, outward appearances belied hidden resentments or entanglements. Even more puzzling was how Emily Parker's nervous demeanour might fit in. Was she simply an anxious bride, or had she glimpsed something truly disturbing? Miss Marple knew that a small detail, like a chance comment from Blythe, might weigh heavily on a sensitive heart, fueling guilt and fear. By the time the clock chimed 7, Miss Marple rose and set aside her thoughts, if only for the evening. She would speak with more villagers, gather further insights, and share the threatening note with a select few she trusted. Piece by piece, the mosaic of Blythe's final days would come together. For now, however, She quietly prepared a modest supper and resolved to rest, mindful that every day brought them closer to the wedding, and she hoped one step nearer to uncovering the truth behind Mr. Blythe's haunting demise. In Chapter 5, a frightening interruption. Night fell gently over St. Mary Mead. Across the peaceful lanes and drowsy rooftops, moonlight cast cool patterns of silver. A warm breeze stirred the hedgerows, and somewhere in the distance, a church bell marked the hour with a single, resonant chime. Though most villagers retired early, content to rest after a day of errands and speculations, a subdued tension clung to the air, as if the shadows themselves harboured secrets. At the park rustle, wedding invitations lay stacked on a side table, awaiting last-minute deliveries. Loose ribbons, half-tied bows, and floral samples crowded the drawing room, signifying the final preparations for Emily Parker's marriage to Gregory Green. By rights, the house should have bristled with excitement. Instead, an uneasy hush prevailed. Emily had retired early, complaining of a headache, while her mother sat in the parlour, fussing with the arrangement of napkins and seat plans, but glancing anxiously at the clock every few minutes. That evening, Miss Marple visited briefly to deliver a small token of her affection, an exquisite lace handkerchief embroidered with pale blue forget-me-nots. "For the wedding day," she'd said kindly, pressing it into Emily's cool hands. The bride had thanked her, voice trembling, before retreating upstairs. Even the presence of Gregory Green, cheerful as he tried to be, could not dispel the heaviness that seemed to envelop the house. Around 10 o'clock, Miss Marple took her leave, murmuring words of reassurance to Mrs. Parker. "Try not to fret," she said gently. "All will be well, I'm sure." Mrs. Parker managed a wan smile, nodding as she escorted Miss Marple out. Yet an underlying worry clung to the older woman's eyes. "Good night, Miss Marple," was all she could manage. Though Miss Marple returned to her own cottage and retired with a cup of chamomile tea, her mind was far from restful. She suspected that some hidden piece of knowledge about Mr. Blythe's death, was troubling Emily deeply. Was it simply that the wedding felt overshadowed by tragedy, or did Emily know something significant and fear speaking out? Drifting off to sleep, Miss Marple quietly resolved to keep a vigilant ear open in the coming days. Shortly after midnight, the calm of St. Mary Mead was shattered by a scream, an unmistakable cry of alarm that rent the silence. Several lights sprang to life in neighbouring windows. Curtains twitched as startled villagers peered out, unsure of the cause. Word travelled swiftly down the lane. Something was amiss at the Parker home. Within minutes, a small group had gathered outside the gate, nightclothes hastily covered by dressing gowns. Colonel Bantry, dressing gown askew, barked instructions for someone to fetch Inspector Slack. Dr. Haydock arrived, bleary-eyed but determined, medical bag in hand. Miss Marple, awakened by the commotion and driven by concern, joined them, her hair hastily tucked beneath a warm cardigan. From inside the house, the front door swung open to reveal Gregory Green. He stood breathless and dishevelled, his usually composed face marked by alarm. "Please, come in," he stammered. "Emily's been frightened half to death." A low gasp passed through those assembled. Miss Marple slipped through the doorway, followed by Dr. Haydock and Colonel Bantry. They found Emily in the dimly lit hall, trembling, her hair loose around her shoulders. Mrs. Parker hovered close by, wringing her hands. The echo of Emily's scream still clung to the walls. Gregory recounted the events in a hushed voice. "Emily was asleep. I was in the next room, going over some paperwork for the reception. I heard her scream, dashed in, and found the window open." She swears she saw a figure, a person dressed in dark clothing, standing by her dressing table. The intruder fled the moment she screamed. "Did they harm you?" Dr. Haydock asked gently, guiding Emily to a chair. She shook her head, teeth chattering. "No, I woke up to see them rifling through my desk drawer. They froze when our eyes met, then climbed out the window. It happened so quickly." Inspector Slack arrived moments later, pushing through the gathering crowd outside and stepping briskly into the hall. His posture was all business as he surveyed the scene. "All right," he barked. "Everyone keep calm. Miss Parker, can you describe the intruder's appearance?" Emily swallowed hard. It was too dark to see the face. They wore a dark coat or cloak, I think. I couldn't tell if it was a man or woman, only that they moved swiftly and were quite agile going through the window. "Nothing stolen," Slack prompted, glancing around the room. Mrs. Parker quickly answered, "We haven't noticed anything missing yet. Emily's jewelry box is untouched. The desk drawer only contained wedding papers, seating lists, a few receipts." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. A rummage for random valuables would point to a common burglary, but that explanation seemed too simple, especially given the hush that had hung over the house. She spoke up softly. "Emily, might the intruder have been searching for something other than jewelry, perhaps a document or letter?" Emily looked startled by the suggestion. I'm not sure. There's nothing in that desk but wedding-related notes." Inspector Slack nodded, rubbing his chin. "We'll inspect the room. Dr. Haydock, would you kindly check Miss Parker for any shock symptoms? The rest of you, please remain here for the moment. I'll have a look at the perimeter." While the inspector and Colonel Bantry set about examining the bedroom and the grounds outside, Miss Marple lingered downstairs, speaking quietly with Emily and Mrs. Parker. Gregory, too, hovered protectively near his fiancée, holding her hand in both of his. Eventually Emily's trembling subsided enough for her to sip some water. Miss Marple knelt beside her chair, voice gentle. "My dear, I know this is terribly frightening, but if there's anything at all, that might link Mr. Blythe's death to this intrusion, we must know. Had you any personal involvement with him, or did you overhear something you weren't meant to?" Emily opened her mouth, hesitated, then closed it again. A small pulse flickered at her temple, suggesting some internal battle. At last, she whispered, "Truly, Miss Marple, I don't know. I never had private dealings with him. He was just an older gentleman who moved in and mostly kept to himself. I only glimpsed him a few times, though. He did try to speak to me once near the post office. He seemed agitated, as though on the verge of confiding something. But then he changed his mind and hurried away." Before Miss Marple could press her further, Inspector Slack returned to the hall, face grim. "No footprints outside the window," he reported, "but I found some scuff marks on the sill. Looks like someone climbed down using the ivy trellis. Whoever it was, they left no obvious calling card." Colonel Bantry, who'd followed behind, piped in, "The bedroom's in a bit of disarray, like they were searching for something. But everything else in the house seems untouched." Mrs. Parker raised a trembling hand to her mouth. "But why Emily's bedroom? She's only got wedding notes and a diary in that desk. None of it would be valuable to a burglar." Inspector Slack nodded, rubbing his chin. "We'll inspect the room. Dr. Haydock, would you kindly check Miss Parker for any shock symptoms? The rest of you, please remain here for the moment. I'll have a look at the perimeter." While the inspector and Colonel Bantry set about examining the bedroom and the grounds outside, Miss Marple lingered downstairs, speaking quietly with Emily and Mrs. Parker. Gregory, too, hovered protectively near his fiancée, holding her hand in both of his. Eventually Emily's trembling subsided enough for her to sip some water. Miss Marple knelt beside her chair, voice gentle. My dear, I know this is terribly frightening, but if there's anything at all, that might link Mr. Blythe's death to this intrusion, we must know. Had you any personal involvement with him? Or did you overhear something you weren't meant to? Emily opened her mouth, hesitated, then closed it again. A small pulse flickered at her temple, suggesting some internal battle. At last, she whispered, "Truly, Miss Marple, I don't know. I never had private dealings with him. He was just an older gentleman who moved in and mostly kept to himself. I only glimpsed him a few times, though he did try to speak to me once, near the post office. He seemed agitated, as though on the verge of confiding something. But then he changed his mind and hurried away." Before Miss Marple could press her further, Inspector Slack returned to the hall, face grim. "No footprints outside the window," he reported, "but I found some scuff marks on the sill. Looks like someone climbed down using the ivy trellis. Whoever it was, they left no obvious calling card." Colonel Bantry, who'd followed behind, piped in, "The bedroom's in a bit of disarray, like they were searching for something. But everything else in the house seems untouched." Mrs. Parker raised a trembling hand to her mouth. "But why Emily's bedroom? She's only got wedding notes and a diary in that desk. None of it would be valuable to a burglar." Inspector Slack gave a nod. "Exactly my thought. This intruder either made a mistake in choosing that room, or they were after something specific. If the latter, we need to ask, what on earth would a bride's personal papers have to do with Mr. Blythe or with any alleged blackmailer?" A heavy silence followed. No one had an answer. Miss Marple regarded Emily's pale face, recalling the earlier conversation about Mr. Blythe's unsettled demeanour. A suspicion grew that Emily, though not guilty of any wrongdoing, might hold a clue she herself did not recognise. The inspector took statements from each member of the household, noting times, locations, and any suspicious details. He advised Mrs. Parker to keep doors and windows locked, especially at night. Dr. Haydock, satisfied that Emily's distress was settling, left with assurances he would check on her again. Colonel Bantry departed to reassure the small knot of curious neighbours that there was no cause for immediate alarm. Finally, in the hush that followed, Miss Marple prepared to leave as well. She looked kindly at Emily. "I'm so sorry this happened to you, my dear. Perhaps you should stay with your mother or Gregory for the remainder of the night. Better to avoid sleeping alone until we're sure of no further trouble." Mrs. Parker agreed swiftly. "Emily can have my room. I'll sit by her, or Gregory can remain in the next room. Anything to stop another fright." Gregory squeezed Emily's hand. "We'll manage, Miss Marple, thank you." Offering a parting nod to Inspector Slack, Miss Marple stepped out into the warm, moonlit darkness. Despite the late hour, her mind whirled. The intruder's midnight visit suggested a targeted motive, not a random theft. Had Emily inadvertently come across some vital piece of evidence? Perhaps a letter or clue linking her to Mr. Blythe's hidden affairs? Or was the intruder, for reasons unknown, trying to intimidate her into silence? Lifting her eyes to the starry sky, Miss Marple took a steadying breath. The wedding was only 2 days away. In times past, such an occasion would have brought unbridled joy. But now, it seemed overshadowed by dread. She silently resolved that, whatever the cost, she would do her utmost to uncover the truth. For Emily's sake and for the good of the village, she had to see that justice prevailed, and that any threat lurking in the shadows was banished by the light of knowledge. Thus, with measured steps, Miss Marple made her way home, the night's silence pressing close. Outside her cottage she paused a moment, peering down the moonlit lane. Somewhere in the darkness, Someone was determined to keep Mr. Blythe's secrets buried, or to find something that might expose them further. Only time and careful sleuthing would reveal the full extent of the danger. But Miss Marple, wise in the ways of human nature, had faced hidden truths before. She would do so again, for the sake of peace in St. Mary Mead, and for one frightened young bride whose wedding day now lay under a cloud of fear. Chapter 6. Unraveled Threads. The sun rose on St. Mary Mead in a wash of gentle pinks and golds, heralding the penultimate day before Emily Parker's wedding. Most villagers, if pressed, would have admitted that beneath the usual bustle of final wedding preparations lay an unspoken tension. News of Emily's midnight intruder had spread swiftly, lending a note of unease to every conversation. Mornings that should have featured cheerful chatter about flower arrangements and wedding hairstyles were instead heavy with curious whispers. Who had been in Emily's bedroom? And why? Miss Marple woke early, her sleep having been fretful. She felt the faint thrum of anxiety that often precedes answers in a mystery, an intangible sense that events were about to move rapidly. After dressing in her usual tidy manner, she sat by her window with a cup of tea, allowing her gaze to drift across the quiet lane. All was peaceful in appearance, yet she knew that peace could be deceptive. Shortly after breakfast, Inspector Slack called at Miss Marple's cottage. He carried his small notebook, a pencil tucked behind one ear. Nodding a polite greeting, he stepped inside and settled in her parlour, where she offered him a seat and a plate of thinly sliced fruitcake. "Thank you, Miss Marple," he began, taking the slightest nibble. "Though I'm in haste, I wanted to update you on our progress. We checked the area around the Parker house but found no footprints. The intruder planned well, or is light on their feet." Miss Marple inclined her head. "It's a tricky business, Inspector, especially with so many wedding guests and villagers coming and going. Any luck tracing that threatening note found by Louisa Chapman?" Inspector Slack shook his head. "So far, no. Our handwriting specialist says it's a common sort of stationery, widely available. No unique watermark or anything of that kind. Still, it confirms Blythe was under pressure." She leaned forward slightly, expression grave. "What about the possibility that Mr. Blythe left something behind? Some letter or document that implicates another person? We know the intruder searched Emily's room without stealing valuables." "That's exactly what puzzles me," Slack admitted, frowning. "I've advised Emily and her family to report any small item they notice missing. If the intruder was after specific evidence, that evidence might be in Emily's possession, unbeknown to her." Miss Marple nodded. "She may have received or handled something, not realizing its significance, or Mr. Blythe might have slipped her a note at some point." The inspector rose, dusting off his notebook. "I'd better continue my inquiries. The wedding's tomorrow, and I suspect whoever's behind this might try something else before then. I'll keep you informed." She thanked him, and he departed as briskly as he'd arrived. Alone once more, Miss Marple pondered the timeline. Mr. Blythe had died unexpectedly, clearly under suspicious circumstances. A threatening letter indicated blackmail or debt. An intruder had searched Emily's bedroom. Each fact seemed linked, though the exact shape of the puzzle remained elusive. By mid-morning, Miss Marple ventured into the village. She found Mrs. Dolly Finch outside the grocer's, discussing the last-minute wedding groceries with an air of busy self-importance. Dolly noticed Miss Marple immediately and beckoned her over, eyes shining as though she had fresh tidings. "My dear Miss Marple," Dolly cried, "you'll never believe it. Old Mrs. Carter saw someone skulking near the footpath behind the Parker garden last night. claimed it might have been a woman, though in the dim light she couldn't be certain. So it's not just the wedding drawing strangers we may have a prowler about. Miss Marple listened intently. A woman, you say? Did Mrs. Carter note any detail about height or clothing? Dolly lowered her voice. Not precisely. Something about a cloak or long coat. The figure moved quickly, as if they knew the paths well. She paused, then added, Between you and me, some folks are muttering that Emily herself might be keeping secrets. Why else would her room be searched? But I say nonsense. That girl's sweet as they come. Miss Marple frowned slightly. Indeed, Emily is a dear girl. Sometimes such rumors stem from fear. I'd caution everyone to be careful with assumptions. With a polite farewell, she left Dolly and continued toward the vicarage. Reverend Caldecott had arranged a rehearsal for the wedding ceremony later that afternoon, and Miss Marple thought it prudent to attend as an onlooker. While she had no formal role in the nuptials, her quiet presence often proved comforting in times of trouble. Inside the church, she found Colonel Bantry, Mrs. Parker, Gregory Green, and a few others already gathered. Emily stood at the front, testing her walk down the aisle. Despite wearing a simple day dress rather than her bridal gown, she held herself with evident tension. Gregory hovered at her side, murmuring reassurance. Reverend Caldecott greeted Miss Marple with a nod. "We're a bit subdued," he confided. "Emily's nerves, you understand. I'm hoping a smooth rehearsal will put her mind at ease." As Emily rehearsed her walk, Miss Marple observed carefully. Now and again, Emily's gaze flickered toward the open doorway, as though expecting someone to burst in with dire news. Whenever the vicar spoke of vows and blessings, she seemed momentarily lighter, only to resume her anxious manner the second attention shifted away. After the rehearsal, Miss Marple approached Gregory Green. The young man was typically cheerful, yet today he appeared worn, shoulders tight with worry. "Gregory," she said gently, "how is Emily bearing up?" "I do worry about her." He exhaled, raking a hand through his hair. "She's struggling, Miss Marple. We both are. I'd do anything to ensure our wedding day is peaceful. But Mr. Blythe's death, the intruder, none of this makes sense. Emily seems convinced there's something she overlooked, something that might explain it all." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "If she recalls anything, no matter how trivial, please encourage her to share it. Sometimes the smallest recollection unlocks a bigger mystery." He agreed, though his eyes remained clouded with concern. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned home to find a note tucked beneath her door. Written in a shaky hand, it read, "Please come to my cottage. I have something you must see. Louisa Chapman." The message, simple though it was, sparked immediate curiosity in Miss Marple's mind. Louisa had already provided crucial information about Mr. Blythe's argument with a stranger. Had she uncovered more? She wasted no time setting off. Louisa Chapman lived in a modest cottage on the outskirts of the village. When Miss Marple arrived, she found Louisa awaiting her on the small porch, wringing her hands. A tiny furrow creased the widow's brow, and she gestured nervously for Miss Marple to enter. Inside, Louisa led her guest to the parlour, where a thin envelope lay on the table. "I found this in my postbox," Louisa explained, voice hushed. "No return address, and it mentions Mr. Blythe by name." With a certain gravity, Miss Marple picked up the envelope and scanned the single sheet of paper within. "Louisa, you were closer to Blythe than people know. If you betray our secret, there'll be consequences. Stay silent. This is your last warning." The note was unsigned, the handwriting unfamiliar. But something in the threatening tone made the hairs on the back of Miss Marple's neck prickle Louisa's voice trembled as she stood by, hands clasped together. "I don't understand. I was never close to Mr. Blythe, not in the sense they imply. I only knew him from the times we'd crossed paths. He seemed kind enough, helped me with groceries once. And then that row in the lane I told you about, but that hardly constitutes a secret bond, does it?" Miss Marple regarded her kindly. "People sometimes assume connections where none exist, or they blame others for fear that their own wrongdoing may be exposed. Are you certain there's no past link to Mr. Blythe from your life outside St. Mary Mead?" Tears sparked in Louisa's eyes. "I've nothing to hide, truly. I came here after my husband's passing, wanting a fresh start. I'd never met Mr. Blythe before I saw him in the village. This note, it's terrifying." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on Louisa's arm. There, my dear. We'll show Inspector Slack, of course, but rest assured, no harm will come to you if we can help it. Whoever's behind this may be desperate, but they're also likely making mistakes." Louisa nodded, visibly relieved to have Miss Marple's calm support. Once she'd collected herself, they agreed that Miss Marple would give the note to Inspector Slack immediately. As Miss Marple made her way out, she paused at the threshold, a swirl of possible scenarios turning in her mind. Someone clearly believed Louisa had knowledge linking them to Mr. Blythe's death. Were they confusing her with another figure in Blythe's life? Or had Louisa innocently stumbled upon some detail she didn't recognize as critical? By early evening, the village swayed once more between wedding excitement and hushed dread. Shops closed, lanes emptied, and lamps glowed faintly in the windows. Miss Marple, having delivered Louisa's note to a grim-faced Inspector Slack, returned to her cottage with the unsettled sense that more pieces were falling into place, yet the overall design still eluded her. She thought of Emily's pale face, Gregory's worried eyes, Louisa's trembling fear. None seemed capable of harming Mr. Blythe, so if they were involved, it must be unwittingly. Then there was the midnight prowler, the threatening letters, the possibility of an old debt or blackmail. In her years of quiet detection, Miss Marple had learned that one seemingly trivial piece of gossip could prove the key, and so she resolved to continue listening, observing, and gently probing where needed. Later, as she prepared for bed, her gaze drifted to the wedding invitation, pinned on her mantelpiece. Tomorrow would be the day at last, the day that was meant to bring only laughter and hope. Yet a shadow hung over it, and Miss Marple feared that if the truth did not emerge soon, the joyous celebration might be marred by darker revelations. Still, she reminded herself of a simple but enduring belief. The most tangled knots of deception and fear can be undone by patience, perseverance, and a keen understanding of human nature. And with that, she allowed herself a small, determined smile before turning down the lamp. Tomorrow was another day, one that might well hold the next step in unraveling the mystery that haunted St. Mary Mead. Now, Chapter 7, A Confession, or so it seems. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, the sky a pale blue canopy over St. Mary Mead. Despite the sun's warmth, a ripple of unease ran through the village. It seemed everyone moved with just a bit more caution, as though mindful that unsettling events could strike again at any moment. If one hadn't known better, one might think there had been an outbreak of some fever. The villagers were jumpy, glancing over shoulders, exchanging tense whispers. Miss Marple rose at her usual hour, dressed with meticulous care in a demure lilac frock, respectful yet modest wedding attire, and then treated herself to a light breakfast. Though it was a day that should have been full of celebratory excitement, she felt a pinch of worry in her chest. Something about the events of the past week weighed heavily on her, and her intuition whispered that the mystery surrounding Mr. Blythe's death was coming to a head. Shortly after 9, she set off towards the church for the wedding ceremony, which was scheduled to begin at 11. At the vicarage gate, she encountered Inspector Slack, who had stationed himself discreetly nearby. He was dressed in a neat, dark suit instead of his usual everyday wear, which lent him a rather solemn air. "Morning, Miss Marple," he greeted, hat in hand. "I'm here to keep an eye on things. There's a sense that whoever trespassed at the Parker house could make another move, especially with so many people gathered." She nodded sympathetically. "I'm afraid that does seem prudent, Inspector. There's an element of desperation about these goings-on. Someone is clearly determined to keep secrets hidden." He gave a terse nod, adding, "If you see or hear anything odd, let me know at once." Inside the church, Miss Marple found a flurry of last-minute activity. The pews were being decorated with slender bouquets of white and pale pink blossoms, and light filtered through stained glass windows, illuminating dancing motes of dust. Reverend Caldecott was busy reviewing final details with Mrs. Parker, whose face was set in a mask of anxious resolve. Gregory Green, standing near the altar, wore a well-tailored suit. He seemed composed, but the tightness around his eyes suggested a man holding himself together through sheer willpower. A hush fell as Emily Parker arrived at the back of the church, dressed in an elegant bridal gown of soft ivory. Even from a distance, Miss Marple could see Emily's hands trembling upon her bouquet of lilies. The bride gave a fragile half-smile to acquaintances who whispered compliments on her appearance. Miss Marple's heart went out to the young woman, for her eyes still carried the shadow of fear. When the organ music began, and Emily proceeded slowly up the aisle, Miss Marple took a seat near the front, ready to witness the exchanging of vows. Reverend Caldecott cleared his throat and began the service, his voice echoing gently through the high arches. Under other circumstances, it would have been an occasion of unalloyed joy. Yet the congregation could not entirely banish thoughts of Mr. Blythe, the threatening letters, and the looming uncertainty of who might be responsible. The vows were spoken in soft tones that strained to sound confident. Gregory's voice held steady. Emily's wavered only slightly. Miss Marple felt relief stirring as the ceremony neared its conclusion. Perhaps, despite everything, the wedding might offer a measure of solace and normalcy. But then, at the moment, Reverend Caldecott asked if anyone knew of any impediment to the marriage. A sudden commotion broke the hush. From the very back of the church, a voice quavered, "Wait, I must speak." Heads turned sharply. There stood Louisa Chapman, her face ashen and her posture unsteady. She leaned on the end of a pew for support, breathing heavily. A wave of shocked murmurs rippled through the congregation. Emily let out a small gasp, and Gregory instinctively reached for her hand. Reverend Caldecott, taken aback, paused, his eyes flicking between Louisa and the suddenly transfixed guests. Miss Marple felt her heart skip a beat. Surely Louisa wasn't about to disrupt the wedding with talk of Mr. Blythe's demise? Seeing that she had everyone's attention, Louisa hesitated, her words catching in her throat. At last she stammered, I'm so sorry. I can't remain silent anymore." She looked desperately at Emily and Gregory. "I know something about Mr. Blythe's death." Another collective gasp surged through the church, and Colonel Bantry, seated a few rows behind Miss Marple, half rose in alarm. Mrs. Parker let out a small cry of distress. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Reverend Caldecott cleared his throat once more, voice echoing in the stunned hush. "Miss Chapman, if there is something relevant, though I must say this is hardly the time—" Louisa shook her head vigorously. I'm sorry. Truly, I am. But I can't let them marry without knowing, without hearing. I was there that night. A flurry of whispers erupted, and Inspector Slack stepped forward from the side aisle, signifying his official presence. Miss Marple watched, her own mind racing. Louisa had been threatened by anonymous letters. Could she be about to make a confession? Or was she trying to protect someone else? Gulping in air, Louisa continued, voice trembling. I'd gone to see Mr. Blythe, intending to ask him to leave me alone. I'd learned he was dabbling in something dreadful. I'd found receipts suggesting blackmail, or maybe something even worse. We argued. She paused, tears glistening on her cheeks. He grabbed my wrist. I tried to push him away. He fell, hitting his head on the table edge. I panicked. I ran off. And then he died, and I didn't summon help. Her words trailed away, drowned out by the church's collective gasp. Some onlookers stared in horror. Others looked unsure whether to comfort her or remain silent. Emily's bouquet slipped from her grasp, petals scattering across the aisle. Gregory placed a protective arm around her shoulders, a worried frown darkening his features. In the midst of this, Inspector Slack stepped forward, expression firm. Miss Chapman, let us speak outside. You're making a serious accusation. Of yourself, I might add. Louisa shook her head with a sort of tragic resolve. I can't bear the guilt any longer. I caused his death, even if not intentionally. Despite her bold words, something in Louisa's eyes struck Miss Marple as uncertain. It was the look of a person forced into a role, as though reading lines from a script she wasn't fully convinced about. Miss Marple might have dismissed it as shock or nerves, but her instincts whispered caution. She rose to her feet, moving calmly to stand near Inspector Slack. Inspector, she said gently, let us take Miss Chapman to the vestry. We can discuss this privately, away from so many prying eyes. Reverend Caldecott nodded shakily. Yes, please. We should continue the ceremony afterward, if possible. The bride, poor Emily, is quite overcome. Gregory guided Emily to a chair beside the altar, cradling her trembling hands. Mrs. Parker dabbed at her eyes, torn between motherly concern and the dramatic turn of events. Meanwhile, the rest of the congregation looked on, some shifting uncomfortably, others whispering behind raised hands. Inside the small vestry, Louisa collapsed onto a wooden chair, tears streaming. Inspector Slack remained standing, notebook at the ready, while Miss Marple discreetly stood nearby. All right, the inspector began softly. Tell us precisely what happened, step by step. Through sobs, Louisa repeated her account. How Mr. Blythe had pressured her, how she discovered some incriminating papers linking him to unscrupulous dealings, how their argument had turned physical, and how he'd fallen. He threatened to ruin me, she choked out, so I tried to leave and he grabbed at me. I shoved him. He struck his head and there was so much blood. I panicked, Inspector, and fled. When she finished, she gazed at the floor, her entire body trembling. Inspector Slack rested a hand on the back of his chair, looking troubled. These are grave matters, he said. If it's true, we must investigate thoroughly. Louisa nodded, tears still falling. I'm confessing now because I've been tormented by it. And all these rumors, threats, and that poor girl's intruder, perhaps they're tied to Blythe's death. I thought if I told the truth, everything else would stop. Miss Marple observed Louisa's posture, the tremor in her voice, and the shape of her story. A part of her believed that Louisa did indeed confront Mr. Blythe, but she also sensed an inconsistency, a gap unaddressed. Perhaps Louisa truly felt responsible, yet something about a faint, desperate look in her eyes suggested she wasn't fully convinced of her own guilt, as though there was more she wasn't saying, or someone else she feared implicating. Inspector Slack closed his notebook. "Miss Chapman, I'll arrange for a formal statement at the station, but for now, let's keep this quiet. We don't want to cause further distress in the church." Sniffling, Louisa merely nodded. Miss Marple, with characteristic kindness, offered her a handkerchief. Louisa accepted it, dabbing her eyes. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I never meant to ruin Emily's wedding, but I just couldn't hide it any longer." Miss Marple placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "We appreciate your honesty," she said gently, "though I suspect there may be more to learn. In time, the full truth will emerge." Stepping out of the vestry, Inspector Slack discreetly informed Reverend Caldecott and Colonel Bantry of the situation. Meanwhile, Miss Marple returned to the bride and groom. She found Emily's face pale, her breath shallow, as she tried to comprehend what had happened. Gregory, dutifully supporting her, murmured words of reassurance. "It appears," Miss Marple said softly, "that Louisa Chapman believes she caused Mr. Blythe's death. We should allow the inspector to investigate further." Emily let out a shaky sigh, pressing a hand to her heart. Poor Louisa. I would never have suspected. Gregory gave a tense nod. "If that's true, at least we have some explanation," he managed, though he, too, appeared uncertain. Reverend Caldecott, clearing his throat, then quietly asked if the ceremony might continue. Emily looked at Gregory, who gently grasped her hand. Though shaken, they both agreed to proceed. The wedding resumed, albeit under a pall of whispered speculation. Vows were exchanged, rings placed upon trembling fingers, and the couple were pronounced husband and wife. A subdued applause rippled through the congregation. Yet, as the newlyweds walked down the aisle, Miss Marple could see the lingering distress in Emily's eyes. Despite Louisa's confession, so dramatic and seemingly final, doubts remained. Had Louisa truly been responsible for everything, or was there some deeper web that she alone could not untangle? Miss Marple had witnessed enough human dramas to know that confessions are not always what they seem. Sometimes a person confesses to protect another, or to shield themselves from a different, darker fear. Leaving the church, Miss Marple cast one last look at the sky, where bright midday sunshine streamed down upon St. Mary Mead. Though the wedding was now complete, the mystery felt anything but resolved. If anything, Louisa's sudden admission had raised as many questions as it answered. Tomorrow, or perhaps even before, Miss Marple felt certain the final revelation would come to light. For the shadow still lingered over the village, and only the whole, unvarnished truth could banish it. Chapter 8. The Unmasking of Truth. Sunlight slanted through the windows of St. Mary Mead's vicarage, illuminating floating specks of dust in the warm afternoon air. The fragrance of freshly cut roses left over from the wedding arrangements lingered near the door. Despite the cheerful setting, there was a pervasive sense of unease among the small group gathered inside. A hush fell as Miss Marple, seated on an upright wooden chair, neatly folded her hands in her lap. In attendance were Inspector Slack, looking rather stern, Reverend Caldecott, his expression troubled, Colonel Bantry, moustache twitching with curiosity, Mrs. Parker anxiously twisting a handkerchief, Dr. Haydock, hands tucked behind his back in professional composure, Louisa Chapman, eyes red and downcast, and of course the newly married couple Emily and Gregory Green. The bride and groom had been fetched from their modest post-wedding luncheon at Mrs. Parker's request. She had insisted that the matter of Mr. Blythe's death be settled once and for all, lest the shadow of tragedy continue to loom. Miss Marple cleared her throat softly and began in her gentle, measured voice. "I am most grateful to you all for gathering here. I know how distressing recent events have been. Louisa Chapman has offered a confession regarding Mr. Blythe's death, and yet I fear we are not in possession of the entire truth." At these words, Louisa bowed her head, colour washing from her cheeks. She still seemed convinced that her own actions had led to Blythe's demise. Her shoulders trembled. Before anyone could speak, Miss Marple offered her a reassuring nod. "My dear Louisa, your confession was very brave. I believe you did struggle with Mr. Blythe, and indeed pushed him. However, I'm now quite certain he was alive, though in distress, after you left the cottage that night." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Emily's eyes widened, while Colonel Bantry raised both bushy eyebrows. Inspector Slack, standing near a small bookshelf, snapped to attention. "Alive," he echoed. "We found no direct evidence of that." Miss Marple nodded sympathetically. "True, but Dr. Haydock's medical examination hinted that Mr. Blythe suffered a blow to the head, which on its own may not have been fatal. The bruising on his wrist and knuckles suggested further struggle. That led me to think he might have encountered someone else after Louisa fled." Louisa looked up, tears brimming. But I saw him bleed. I was certain—" Miss Marple's voice was kind. "Fear can be very persuasive, my dear. In your panic, you assumed the worst, but it seems he was still conscious, briefly at least, and more harm was done." Turning her steady gaze to the newlyweds, Miss Marple went on. "As for the intruder who ransacked Emily's desk, well, I suspected they might have been searching for something Mr. Blythe left behind. He'd hinted at a secret, possibly blackmail. With so many local rumours about debts and threats, it stands to reason that Blythe kept evidence somewhere, and when certain persons feared that Emily had unknowingly received that evidence, they took great risks to retrieve it." Emily's hand fluttered to her throat. "But I never received anything from him, nothing at all." Gregory Green placed a comforting arm around his wife. "Emily knows nothing. She wouldn't conceal important papers from the police, especially not after the break-in." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Yes, indeed, Emily wouldn't conceal them. But we must consider the possibility that Mr. Blythe slipped something inside those wedding notes, perhaps a letter or a key, without Emily noticing. There was no time for him to speak openly, so he may have acted surreptitiously. I believe that's why the intruder targeted Emily's room, rather than searching the entire Parker house." Reverend Caldecott cleared his throat, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged room. "But who, then, is responsible for Mr. Blythe's final demise?" Miss Marple's kind eyes rested on Gregory Green. "The final piece fell into place for me, Mr. Green, when I recalled your occasional anxiety during the wedding preparations. You repeatedly asked if Emily had mentioned anything about Blythe. A normal groom might be curious about the hush over Blythe's death, but you seemed deeply troubled. Even the night of the intruder you appeared breathless and not entirely surprised." Gregory's face paled. Emily stared at him, confusion etched on her features. "Gregory," she whispered. "What is she saying?" I don't know," he stammered, dropping his gaze. Miss Marple clasped her hands. "You see, Mr. Green, Mr. Blythe recognized you from London. He knew something about your past, a questionable business or perhaps a financial scandal. He threatened to expose you, especially if he believed you had not fulfilled some debt or promise. That letter Louisa found, mentioning, "We haven't forgotten, you owe us," might well have applied to more than one person, but I fear you were the one genuinely indebted, Mr. Green. Inspector Slack stared at Gregory. "Is that true? Were you indebted to Blythe?" Gregory tried to collect himself, but his words emerged in a rush. "It was never meant to go this far. Blythe and I had a business arrangement years ago. I thought it was settled. Then he turned up here of all places, demanding money again, threatening to wreck my reputation. I couldn't bear the thought of Emily discovering my mistakes, so I confronted him on the night he died." Beside him, Emily's lips parted in a silent gasp. She clutched his arm in a mix of shock and dismay. Gregory continued, eyes downcast. "I went to his cottage after Louisa left. He was injured, bleeding and furious. He accused me of orchestrating the confrontation with Louisa, said I'd manipulated her to put him off balance. That's not true," he added hastily, shooting a glance at Louisa's stricken face. "But Blythe wouldn't listen. He demanded the full sum of money or he'd ruin me." Dr. Haydock stepped forward, voice gentle but insistent. "So what happened next?" Gregory's breath hitched. "He tried to phone someone. Maybe the police, maybe an associate. In desperation, I grabbed the receiver away. He stumbled. I didn't mean to harm him, but he collapsed. His heart must have given out from the shock or the pain of his earlier injury." Soft murmurs of dismay filled the room. Mrs. Parker's hand flew to her mouth. Colonel Bantry let out a low whistle. The hush in the vicarage deepened as Gregory bowed his head. He was alive one moment, struggling for breath. Then he just... Gregory faltered, unable to continue. Miss Marple spoke kindly yet firmly. "No matter how frightened one is, leaving a gravely injured man without medical aid is a dreadful act. You hurried away, hoping his passing would be blamed on the confrontation with Louisa. When the rumors sprang up and Louisa's confession emerged, you saw a chance to remain silent, but your nervousness revealed that you carried guilt of your own." Emily's eyes brimmed with tears, heartbreak lining her features. "Oh, Gregory," she whispered, "why didn't you trust me? We could have faced this together." He shook his head, voice cracking. "I feared you'd call off the wedding or despise me for my past. It was selfish, I see that now. I never meant to kill him truly." Inspector Slack inhaled sharply, taking a step forward. "This is a serious admission, Mr. Green. Accident or not, you'll have to answer for Mr. Blythe's death." Gregory nodded, tears gathering at the corners of his eyes. "I understand," he managed, turning to Emily with a look of desperate remorse. "I'm so sorry." The bride's face was a picture of anguish. Before she could respond, Louisa Chapman spoke up, tears spilling freely. "I blame myself all this time, but I see now. I left Blythe alive, and it was your confrontation afterward that proved fatal." Miss Marple rested a gentle hand on Louisa's arm. "None of us could have known the entire truth until now. We must, however, acknowledge your role. Pushing him might have contributed to his downfall, but you acted in self-defense, and you did not deliver the final blow." Reverend Caldecott, deeply shaken, whispered a prayer under his breath. Mrs. Parker, tears in her eyes, moved closer to Emily, placing a trembling arm around her daughter's shoulder. Inspector Slack's voice cut through the sorrowful hush. "Mr. Green, You will come with me to make a full statement. Depending on Dr. Haydock's medical findings, the law may regard this as manslaughter or involuntary homicide, but it is for the courts to decide." Gregory nodded numbly. Emily's tears spilled over, but she allowed him to touch her hand one last time before Inspector Slack guided him toward the door. His head bowed in shame. The assembled group stood silent, the gravity of the situation pressing upon them like a physical weight. Colonel Bantry cleared his throat, trying to regain composure. "A terrible tragedy," he murmured, echoing the sentiments everyone felt. Louisa sank into a chair, weeping softly from relief and lingering guilt. Dr. Haydock placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, murmuring words of solace. Mrs. Parker comforted Emily, who stared through teary eyes at the empty doorway where Gregory had just disappeared. At length, Reverend Caldecott spoke, voice trembling yet resolute. "Let us remember that no one can hide from the truth forever. Perhaps this knowledge, painful though it is, can be the beginning of healing for our community." Miss Marple rose quietly, her kind eyes taking in the scene of heartbreak. She offered Emily a compassionate embrace, gently patting her arm. Then she turned to Louisa, whose tears had slowed, though her expression was still haunted. "You acted in fear, my dear," she said softly. "But you did the right thing when you spoke up. Ultimately, it was your bravery in telling what you knew that helped bring everything to light." Outside, the sun still shone on St. Mary Mead, casting golden beams across the vicarage lawn. Life went on in the little village. Gardens would need tending, tea shops would open for afternoon custom, and the hush of wedding excitement would soon give way to daily routines. But all those present felt the sobering effects of the truth. One life had ended, another was in ruin, and many hearts had been bruised by secrets and dread. Yet, as Miss Marple stepped into the sunshine, she allowed herself a small measure of hope. Hard though it was, the truth had emerged, and in her many years observing human nature, she had found that the truth, when finally laid bare, could allow for understanding, repentance, and possibly even forgiveness. St. Mary Mead would heal in time, she reflected, as gentle breezes stirred the rose bushes by the gate. For now, one chapter had closed, and though sorrowful, it left the path open for a calmer tomorrow.